Hey friend, thank you so much for checking out our YouTube channel. My name is Justin and I'm one of the pastors here at One Life Church. I pray that this sermon that you're about to watch will bless you and encourage you as you follow the person of Jesus. I want to turn your attention to the description below. There's some links in the description that will help you learn more about One Life Church and stay connected to this church family. One link that you'll find is for the Bible app. We use the Bible app here at One Life for sermon notes, announcements, scripture readings. So go ahead and click on that link and follow along as you watch today's teaching. All right, friend, thanks so much for hanging out. Let's jump into the sermon.
All right, hey guys, welcome to One Life this morning. Today we are finishing up our Rhythm of Life Together series. And if you are eagle-eyed, you will notice that we have skipped one element of our gathering this morning, and that is intentional because it is the subject of this final message of the series, communion. So we're going to talk about communion a little bit today, and then we're going to celebrate it at the end. Now, your kids in their huddles are learning basically the same thing you guys are. So they are also learning about communion today. And then they're going to come in, and we are all going to take it together. Now, we are going to explore this ancient practice today. We're going to talk to each other about it. We're going to celebrate it together. And also, this week is kind of interesting because not only is it the last week of our Rhythm of Life Together series, it is also the first Sunday of the Lent season. Last week was Ash Wednesday. We are in the 40 days in preparation of Easter. And next week, we are going to start our Lenten series, and it's going to be based on a book by Brian Zahn called Sinners in the Hands of a Loving God. And I encourage you all to pick it up on Amazon, read it. I've been reading it. It is phenomenal. And this book is kind of a reframing or almost a rebuttal to the old Jonathan Edwards sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And it is looking at just how much we are beloved by the Father and what that means to us as we prepare our hearts and minds for Easter. Now, if you have been around One Life for longer than 1 week, you will know that communion happens here every single time we get together. And I know that's kind of unusual outside of the Catholic, Anglican, Episcopalian traditions, but for me, that is all I've ever known, is celebrating communion every single week. And in the church that I grew up in, you weren't allowed or invited to take communion until after you were baptized. And I was baptized when I was almost 13 years old. And I remember the very first time I ever took communion. I can tell you where I was sitting. I can tell you what the room looked like. And I remember being so keyed up before communion because it was like I knew this time the tray is not going to pass me. So I was like, okay, Carrie, you know what to do. You've been watching this for 13 years. You can do this. Bread first, juice next. Don't spill. Whew. And the tray came around. And at the time, before COVID and we knew about germs, we all had like one cracker. And we were supposed to like break off a piece and then take it. And I was so nervous, and the cracker came around, and I was so nervous I was going to like break off half of the whole thing. And so I was being gentle, and I remember I missed the cracker. And I came away with like half a crumb of matzo dust on my finger. And then I got the juice, and I was like, I can't say anything. This is my first time. I am not screwing this up. So like I remember I was like, really concentrate on the taste of the dust on my fingers. Like, okay, I think that's it. There we go. I got it. And I remember that moment. I still remember like the feel of it in my hands when I messed it up. But what I remember most about that moment is just the weight of how important it was. It meant that I was now considered part of the church. And I was invited to participate in this meal as a sister. And I felt that inclusion. And honestly, it was one of the first times I remember feeling a kind of responsibility that comes with being part of the family of Jesus. The Eucharist, communion, the Lord's Supper. It is one of the oldest sacraments in the Christian faith. Like baptism, we see it practiced from the early days of the church. In fact, baptism and communion are the only two sacraments that are universally practiced in Christianity. Now, why do I keep saying sacrament? I know it's not really a word that we use in the Protestant tradition, but I think it's the best word to describe what happens at communion and baptism. So the word comes from a Latin word, sacramentum. And that was a translation of a Greek word for a mystery that has been revealed. Paul explains this to the Colossian church in Colossians 1:25 through 27. He says, I have become its servant by the commission God gave me to present to you the word of God in its fullness. The mystery that has been kept hidden for ages and generations, but is now disclosed to the Lord's people. To them, God has chosen to make known among the Gentiles the glorious riches of this mystery, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. Baptism and communion are both physical ways to help us understand the mystery of Jesus. How God could come in the flesh, give up his life, and impart his spirit into our hearts because he loves us. And he wants us to be reconciled to him. And I can tell you right now, I don't fully get that. And I don't think I'll fully get it until I stand before God one day. But for now, we have these sacraments to help us make that connection from the heavenly to the earthly. Both are highly symbolic. And the elements were chosen purposefully to represent specific spiritual truths. And both are markers for important events in the life of the Christian and the life of the church. And because these two sacraments are so old and universally practiced and so important, they are a breeding ground for division. And honestly, I think that is one of the enemy's best tactics. Don't get rid of something, just make everybody do it and then fight about it. It is just part of human nature. We find something good and we fight about it. That's what we do. But we actually have some weapons to overcome this. Paul gives us guidance in 2 Corinthians 10, verses 2 through 5. Paul says, I beg you that when I come, I may not have to be as bold as I expect to be towards some people who think that we live by the standards of this world. That's like a standard Paul greeting. Like, watch out when I get there. But he says, for though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. I love that. We have divine power to destroy strongholds. And how do we do this? By destroying arguments, tearing down obstacles to knowledge, and keeping our thoughts fixed on Jesus. Unity, knowledge, and unshakable faith. Those are our weapons, and what we're going to use to look at communion as the beautiful gift it is. So first, let's talk about unity, and with it, a question. Who is invited to the Lord's table? Quick question. Raise your hand if you grew up in a church where communion was offered to some but not to all. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty common. It's pretty common. And it has a long history, this practice of not opening the table to everyone. And you know how much I love history, so we're going to have a history moment with Carrie. So, in case you're not familiar, One Life is connected to something called the Restoration Movement. We have cousins in the Church of Christ, the Christian church, and the disciples of Christ. So two of the founders of this movement were Thomas Campbell and his son Alexander. And they came over from Scotland in the early 1800s, right when the Second Great Awakening was going on. Now, if you want to talk division in the church, it was super crazy back then. So the Campbells were Presbyterian, but they weren't just like regular Presbyterian. They were Old Light, Anti-Burger, Seceder, Presbyterian, which means I guess there were like New Light, Pro-Burger, OG Presbyterians or something like that back then. But in the Old Light, Anti-Burger, Seceder Presbyterian Church, they had this practice called fencing the table. And it means exactly what it sounds like. They took the communion table and put it behind a fence in the church. And then, when they would go to celebrate communion, each church member, before the communion Sunday, because they only did it twice a year, they would have to present themselves before the elders and prove their worthiness to take communion. And y'all, this didn't start as a doctrinal thing. It started because the church was too big and communion was taking too long. No lie. They had to make it shorter, and that's what they decided to do. So then, when they were before the elders, if they were the right kind of Christian, if they were in good standing, if they belonged to this specific sect, they passed the test. And they were given a token, a literal metal coin that they had to present on the day of communion. And before they would go up to take communion, they would have to put the token in this like pewter plate, and then they could go behind the fence and receive communion. So, in 1809, 21-year-old Alexander Campbell was sitting there one day in Scotland, token in hand, and he was really struggling with this whole idea. He's like, this is super weird and it's not in the Bible. How dare anyone tell me I have to have a coin to approach communion? He's like, how could anyone keep anyone away from the Lord's table? It's not my table, it's God's table. Why are we allowing so much division? And as the story goes, he sits there like watching this happen. And he waits until the very end of communion, and he is just getting filled with more and more righteous indignation. And when the time came for him to decide if he was going to take communion or not, he walks up and he threw his token into the pewter tray, and it made this bong sound. He turned around, walked out, and never walked back in again. 3 months later, he was on a boat to America to meet up with his father and the other men who would eventually become the founders of the Restoration Movement. Campbell's biographer says this of that moment. He says, the ring of that token as it fell from his hand, like the ring of Martin Luther's hammer on the door of the Wittenberg Cathedral, announced the renunciation of the old church ties and marks the moment of which he forever ceased to recognize the claims or authority of a human creed to bind upon men the conditions of their acceptance with God. The movement to which this church belongs was founded on the idea that human divisions have no part in God's family, that this table belongs to the Lord, and neither you nor I have any authority to say who is allowed to approach it and who isn't. In the Bible, we see Jews partaking with Gentiles, rich partaking with the poor, men partaking with women. Even the very first communion, the Last Supper, it was a table filled with fishermen, a former stooge for Rome, a Jewish political freedom fighter, a betrayer, a coward, some guys with serious anger issues, most likely a woman who was demon-possessed at one point, and a lot of moms. And it was presided over and made holy by none other than God incarnate. We are a people all about tables, not fences. And that is why we invite everyone to participate in communion and join us in this meal. But I don't want anyone to think that just because our table is open, it doesn't mean the practice isn't serious nor intended for reverence, because it absolutely is. And the Bible actually gives instruction on when we should participate in communion and when we shouldn't. The church at Corinth loved celebrating communion. And when I say celebrate, I mean celebrate. They had a whole meal, and everyone would bring food to it, and not just like this food, like lots of food. The poor would bring what they had, and the rich in the church would bring the finest food they could bring and eat it all themselves in front of the poor people without sharing. They brought their own wine to communion and would get drunk on it at church. Yeah. The Lord's Supper had become this symbol of decadence, highlighting the haves and the have-nots in the church. And it caused division, which was the opposite thing Jesus set out to do. Honoring Jesus had taken a total backseat to this party that the rich in the church were having. So here is what Paul said about what should and should not be going on during communion. And I'm going to read it from the Message version because I think it really captures Paul's attitude when he was writing it. He says this: "What you must solemnly realize is that every time you eat this bread and every time you drink this cup, you reenact in your words and your actions the death of the Master." So that is what we do. You will be drawn back to this meal again and again until the Master returns. You must never let familiarity breed contempt. He says, anyone who eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Master irreverently is like part of the crowd that jeered and spit on him at his death. Is that the kind of remembrance you want to be part of? Examine your motives, test your heart, and come to this meal in holy awe. If you give no thought, or worse, don't care about the broken body of the Master, when you eat and drink, you are running the risk of serious consequences. Paul is explaining to the church here that communion is not mandatory. If you feel like you're just going through the motions, don't take it. If you don't believe in what communion stands for, don't take it. There is no shame or judgment in that. Whatever happens in your heart in this time is between you and God. We do not take attendance at the table. We don't know who takes it and who doesn't. We offer a seat for everyone, but we understand that accepting the invitation is up to you. So, what are we supposed to think about during communion? How do we approach the table? What should be on our mind as we're holding these elements? Now, I have heard this question dozens of times over many, many years. And this is that knowledge piece of the puzzle I want to talk about. You know, at one point, I thought that when I took communion, what I was supposed to do is just go over all the sins I had committed in the week and tell God I'm sorry. But that's not what Jesus did at the Last Supper. He didn't look at the disciples and go, okay, now's the time for you to tell me just how bad you are and how sorry you are for being that way. No. I think that falls more into that idea of the sinners in the hands of an angry God, that we have to appease this God, like Jonathan Edwards said, who's just holding us over this fire, looking for a way to punish us. That's not at all what Jesus said. Here's what Jesus said we are to do. Do this in remembrance of me. Now, here's a little exercise that might help us process this. Really quick, I want you to think about your grandma's signature holiday dish, or your mom, or the person who cooked the most around holidays when you were a child that you have really good memories of, okay? What's that food you're thinking of? Go ahead, tell somebody beside you real quick. Love it. All right, you got it in your head? Okay. Here is what I'm thinking of. My grandma Dandaran's famous broccoli chicken noodles. Oh my gosh. They were so good. Every holiday, they would be on the table, and my cousins and I would just devour it. And my grandma was so sweet. I spent a lot of time growing up with her. And I'd go home to her house after church every Sunday, and every time I asked for her special noodles, she would make them for me like right away. It was like magic. Those noodles are the taste of my childhood. Then when I grew up and I started cooking for myself, I was like, Grandma, I'm about to get married. I'm about to start cooking. I need your chicken broccoli noodle recipe. And she was like, what are you talking about? And I said, the chicken noodles you made all the time, that we ate all the time. She looked at me kind of funny and she said, Carrie, it's a Lipton soup mix. You just add water. I was stunned. But then I realized that I could just go to Food Lion and get it anytime I wanted in a little bag for $1. It was great. So I can have my grandma's super special chicken noodles anytime I want. And I cook them all the time. And every time I make them and I eat them, I am transported right back to my grandma's kitchen table. It is such a simple meal, but it's one that brings me back to Thanksgivings and Sunday afternoons and sleepovers and cousins and family. That is what communion does for us. It is such a simple meal. But the taste of the bread and the taste of the cup on our tongue transports us to memories of worship with our church families. The first time we celebrated it. Important moments we celebrated it, like when Paul and I celebrated it at our wedding. Each time we take communion, we are participating in a family meal that goes back through the ages to an upper room, the night before our Savior gave up his life for us. We have this sensory experience in this sacrament to remind us that Jesus' sacrifice paved the way for us to belong to God, his kingdom, and a huge family of believers. And I know I've said that before, but I never want you to forget it. So when we celebrate the Lord's Supper, please don't think you have to always turn it into a time of weeping and gnashing of teeth. Jesus' blood and his body are a gift that we're invited to celebrate with gratitude. So here are just a few short ideas that if you're still wondering what you could meditate on when we have that quiet time, here are just some things you can think about. So you could think about what Jesus did on the cross. Consider his sacrifice. Consider all he went through out of his love for the world. You can think about what that means to you now. How does Jesus' sacrifice change how you view yourself and others, and how does it impact your relationship with God? You can think about what it's meant to you in the past. Think back to meaningful times you've celebrated communion. How was God present in those moments? How do you see those moments in light of where God has brought you today? And then gratitude. Just approach communion with a spirit of gratitude. If all you can say is thank you, that's all you need to say. Thank God for giving you a seat at the table through Jesus. What an honor it is to be welcome at the same meal first begun by him. And then carry that spirit of communion with you into daily life. And how do we do that? How do we take this spiritual practice into our everyday life? Well, one thing you can do is celebrate communion regularly. And I'm not just talking about here at One Life. Yes, we celebrate it regularly here, but you don't need any special authority to serve and partake in communion. Not at all. If you're traveling with your family over the weekend, bring some with you and celebrate it on the beach or in the mountains, wherever you are, and just experience the beauty and nature and gift of God. Celebrate communion in special moments of your life to remember how Jesus brought you to that place. Celebrate it with your 242 groups. In fact, we have a family in our 242 group who regularly puts family communion on their calendar. And then at home, they will spend an evening taking communion with their kids as part of their family discipleship, teaching their children about it, explaining the elements, explaining what it means around their own kitchen table. It's such a simple thing. And we can do that to remember Jesus as the source of every blessing we've been given. Another thing you can do is to open your tables. Earlier this week, a ministry friend of mine shared this image with our preaching group. And it's this picture of this French woman in World War II carrying this huge bread and 6 bottles of wine through the city of Paris. And we were talking about like that picture and what it makes us think when it comes to communion. And for me, this image is such a great symbol of what it's like to carry communion with you. She's out in her community. She has way more than she needs. She is available to share with anybody that comes up. She's not pretentious. She's dressed just as she is. She's got something on her robe. Like, she's just there with her people. Now, don't think I'm telling you to literally do this, but if you find a 6-foot-tall baguette, I want to hear about it. That's pretty cool. But be someone who is known for your openness to others. Someone who is willing to share and invite people in. Someone who builds bigger tables, not walls and fences. And then, never stop remembering and proclaiming. 1 Corinthians 11:26 teaches, "For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." As long as we are still here on earth, we are called to proclaim and remember Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection as often as we can. Communion isn't just a partaking, but a proclaiming. We are actively saying something when we eat the elements. We say, I remember what Jesus did. I am coming to this table to commune with the King of Kings as part of his kingdom, and I will continue to do so until he returns or I return to him. Man, that is a powerful statement of faith, and one we are called to repeat as often as we can, as we open our tables to anyone who wants to join us.